Welcome, everyone. My name is Vanessa de la Torre, and I'm the financial officer of NAHJ New England. We're so honored that Jelani Cobb is here as our special guest for our final En Hora Buena of 2022. Welcome, Dean Cobb.
Thank you.
Our chapter created this series of virtual conversations to celebrate, hear, and learn from the very best in journalism, all while raising money for scholarships. And we're going to give you a little bit more info on that in a bit. But first, Dr. Cobb is a distinguished journalist, scholar, and historian, and a leading voice in our society on race, politics, and culture. You all know that he's the newly appointed dean of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, Columbia J School. He's also a staff writer for The New Yorker, the author of several books. His articles and essays have been widely published. He's done documentaries. He's a Peabody Award winner and a 2018 Pulitzer Prize finalist in commentary. Prior to Columbia, he was an associate professor of history and director of the Africana Studies Institute at UConn. We're so grateful for your presence here at our En Hora Buena. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're so excited that our own chapter president, Cindy E. Rodríguez, is moderating this conversation. Cindy is a veteran journalist who has covered immigration for the Boston Globe, race and cultural affairs for the Detroit News, and was award-winning columnist for the Denver Post. And now she's a senior journalist in residence at Emerson College in Boston. And Cindy also happens to be a Columbia J School alum.
Oh, wait, I didn't even know that.
Yes.
Cool.
And we also want to quickly thank our sponsor for this event and the En Hora Buena series, the New England News Collaborative, which I lead as executive editor. We're a collaboration of 9 public media stations in the region, and we support amplifying these important conversations uncovering our communities. Overall, our chapter's En Hora Buena series has raised about $7,500 so far from media sponsors in public media. And with your help, we aim to raise $10,000 by the end of this year to fund our first NAHJ New England chapter scholarship to support the next generation of Latinx journalists. And we're almost there. Please help us reach our goal, giving what you can or helping spread the word. We'll put a donation link in the chat. If you have any questions during this hour, don't be shy. Our format was designed to be relaxed and conversational. Cindy will ask some questions to get us going, and then in the last 20 minutes or so, she'll open it up to questions from the audience. But throughout the hour, you could absolutely drop questions in the chat. And with that, take it away, Cindy.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, and welcome, Dr. Jelani Cobb. I'm a longtime fan. You have a whole group of folks here who are stands, and congratulations on your appointment as Dean of the J School at Columbia.
I'm actually just getting to see, like because the size of the icon expanded, I can now read the sign behind you. And I was like, I totally want one of those. Like, that's like a great motto to have.
I have that to remind myself that I've got the work hard thing I have down packed, but sometimes I have to work on the be nice to people. And actually, we're going to get into that a little bit. Mm-hmm. While preparing for this event, I was looking at things you've written, videos. And there was a recent one where you're asked this very poignant question: what's the thread of your life's work? Mm-hmm. And you said, quote, "If there's any through line in my work, I think it has been attempting to humanize African Americans and to defend the humanity of African Americans, to write about us with all the nuance and complexity that other people from other communities have been written about for eons," end quote. And mm-hmm. that is like so deep. It resonates with all of us in the work that we're trying to do. And I'm wondering, if you can talk a little bit about how we can do this work, because it's not easy to do in predominantly white newsrooms. So I'm wondering how you've navigated situations where you've had editors question or confuse your empathy with bias, and how mm-hmm. do you get them to understand that they have a bias that goes unquestioned?
Yep. So first, let me say that I'm very thankful to be able to talk with you today. And I have like a particular disposition toward New England, from, my years in Hartford and in and around the University of Connecticut. And then like, even when I was in Hartford, a good part of my social life was in Boston. And I was kind of zipping around through, that part of the country, and really developed quite a bit of affection for it. So I'm happy to virtually be back in contact there. That's it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, toward the point that you made about the preface, I think that, so we have a kind of dual conflict, which is that we have institutions that have blind spots, and they are blind to the blind spots. And so it's not only a kind of the work of getting people to recognize, here are these things that you don't see, or these things that you don't get. It's having to point out to them that there even are things that they're not seeing and that they're not getting. And, while we're talking about currently this crisis of trust in kind of establishment media, there's been a crisis of trust in those outlets, from the community I came from for my whole life. People were always distrustful of, like, the New York Times is the paper of record. People were always distrustful, of the Times. Anybody who lived through the Central Park Five was distrustful of mainstream media. Or if we took it out of that context, the lead up to the Iraq War, the tragic ineptitude of the handling of the 2016 election. And those are just kind of the major things that just jump out at you. We could kind of walk through headline by headline, the ways in which establishment media and really respected media organizations have fallen down on the job, but that hasn't necessarily translated into a greater degree of humility about what people know, about what they don't know, and so on. So I think that for people who are trying to make their way, and to try to broaden the perspectives, one last thing I'll say is that when you get past the double blindness and down to a single layer of blindness, where people will say, oh, okay, so maybe we need to diversify our newsroom, or these pressures to have different voices of different perspectives and so on. But that, even then, it doesn't necessarily translate to actually empowering those voices. So the person is there, but you want to continue to kind of operate in the same way that you always did. And I've had those battles my whole career. Some of them I lost, some of them I won. But the thing that has been most useful to me, and this is not even just for media organizations, I think this is for people who are navigating lots of different types of institutions, is finding like-minded people and creating a network of people who understand that, one, it's not you're not imagining it, you're not losing it in terms of seeing that these dynamics take place because other people are experiencing them. And two, strategizing about how you move forward. One of the things that I've done, that I've noticed that I get invited to do now in my career, is that very often, this happened to me 3 months ago. And it's happened for the last 10 years or so, that as I've started to get more notability and profile and so on, I get invited by lots of organizations, by people within those organizations, solely for the purpose of reiterating the thing that they've been saying all along in their company. And I can come in and say things because I don't work there. Someone has brought me in, I'm there for 4 hours, I give a talk, and I say all the things that people have been saying there. And sometimes that actually helps. Sometimes it's the idea that, there's this neutral party, or this party that doesn't have a dog in this fight, and they are here to kind of point out that, yeah, the logic of criticism that has been, launched by people who are internal holds up. That's been for me in corporate environments. I've had that happen in academic environments, and I've most certainly had that happen in media environments. So I think that finding like-minded people on the level of moral and emotional support is really crucial. And then strategically, sometimes you can make the point collectively in a way that resonates more than the individual making the point kind of in the wilderness does. And then also kind of soliciting additional kind of outside, voices. And then the last thing I'll say is, I talked with Nicole about this like a good bit, Nicole Hannah-Jones, about a good bit like around the work that she was doing that culminated in 1619, but the work she was doing prior to that around segregation in schools. She said it took her 12 years to write those stories. And some of it was just a matter of surviving day to day long enough to build up the credibility and the kind of reserve of respect for your work that allowed her to say, we really need to do this particular thing. And the story that I tell about, I tell my students the story all the time, that we all kind of live and die by FOIAs. We're all, filing public records requests. Most of the time, we don't know how we got to have a Freedom of Information Act. And the Freedom of Information Act came about literally because a guy watching TV and sees Joe McCarthy and is like, no, like, this is terrible. He's abusing the national security infrastructure and the kind of government secrecy to say, oh, I can't explain why I think this person is a communist, but just trust me on it. And he said, we need to demystify what the government is doing and to the greatest extent possible, make information available to people. He ran for Congress twice, got elected the second time, spent 12 years in Congress building up enough seniority to pass a law, and then got President Lyndon B. Johnson on board to sign this Freedom of Information Act law in 1966. It took him 16 years from the point at which he recognized there was this problem. I'm not at all encouraging people to wait 16 years to resolve a problem, but I am saying that sometimes longevity is what's required to actually see these things through.
Thank you so much. There's so many points of inquiry that I can go with, and I'll let folks who are in the audience maybe start formulating some questions around that. But one of the things that we see is that people do get burnt out and they leave, and then it has to be started all over again.
Yep.
And sometimes it's hard to have those, to have a coalition in a newsroom, because you might be one of three, you might be one of five, but so that's a difficult thing in itself. I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about the importance of history and for people to really know the true history. Noam Chomsky has said that education is a system of imposed ignorance. Our schools, textbook industry, all kinds of political nefarious forces, they want to erase the history, if it's even included, which oftentimes it's not. It's just a mention, it's just a photograph and a little caption about an important leader, but no real insight into like what actually took place. And so the problem with that is that unless you are questioning these things or you self-educate and you learn about these histories, you just don't know. You're ignorant, and then you go into the newsroom as an editor or as a reporter, and you continue to inflict harm on communities of color. And then we saw, like, after the reckoning, after the murder of George Floyd by police officers, and the uprisings that happened afterwards, that newsrooms leaders had made this pledge. They've made them before. We're going to do better. We're going to do things differently now. We're going to correct the record. And there's been some improvements here and there. We've seen, more people of color hired. Well, not a lot, but here and there, and
Right.
again, maybe some promotions.
Yeah.
And they're doing great work, but the problem is they're not enough to stem the tide of all the racist tropes that continue, the stories that go in with, missing crucial historical and contextual information. And so I'm just wondering, like, how can we change this in a more immediate way? Like, can we persuade or prod newsroom leaders to deepen their knowledge? Is there a way to incentivize it for them? Should guilds be pushing for this? Because it doesn't seem like they're going to do it on their own.
So I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that when I sat down and kind of wrote the list of things I would want to do if I was dean, which I'll start out by saying it was not on my list of ambitions to become a dean. Like, it never crossed my mind. And even when it first was brought up to me, one of my colleagues said, you should think about being the next dean. I nearly did a spit take. I had a drink and I was like, wait, what? And I then had to start from square one and actually write out like the list of things that, would make this job worth doing. One of the first things on that list was that I want to create a required American history for reporting class. And the reason for that is, like, there's a general practical necessity for it. And then there's a bigger issue of, like, the point that you just made. On the practical necessity of it, if you are in a newsroom or you are in any kind of news outlet, especially if you are, covering one subject one day and on to another thing another day, you need to have some contextual information about what it is that you're reporting on. And I said, our students need to have at least 50 years of background on all of the major beat areas. So if you're talking about what are the transformations in the economy in the last 50 years? What are the transformations, the general trends in American foreign policy in the last 50 years? Criminal justice, the White House, those things, just so that you have working knowledge of the thing that you are covering. Where in the movie you walked in. And so that just practical necessity. In the bigger sense, the kind of resume version of history, like the long litany of great things that the United States represents, has made people particularly vulnerable to falling prey to the same sorts of mistakes that we've seen previously. And with my students, I always have this conversation. I do this thing where I say, okay, so today we're going to talk about a population, an immigrant population in significant numbers in California that is being criticized for bringing drugs into the country and taking jobs from white people, mainly, who live in California. And we say, oh, okay, well, who are we talking about? We're talking about the nativist assaults on Latinos in California. I'm like, no, I'm talking about the Chinese in the 19th century, which is exactly what logic led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It was the argument that the Chinese were bringing opium and that they were taking opium into the country and that they were taking jobs from white people. And I'll say, okay, now we're going to talk about a religious minority that is suspected of holding sympathies with with enemies of the United States, that has sympathetic toward terrorists, and which has been placed under surveillance by the federal government. And okay, now we're talking about Muslims. No. Now we're talking about Jews at the beginning of the 20th century, especially around World War I, when people thought that the Jews were disproportionately sympathetic toward anarchists, who considered kind of bombings as part of the kind of political discourse, that they were believed to be sympathetic toward Bolsheviks, other people who had un-American, quote unquote, un-American interests, and who were placed under surveillance by the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer. If we are having these conversations and we are called upon to write about what is happening in front of us, and we don't know what has happened just before that, then we are not really capable of doing the best service by our audiences. And that is crucial. That's something that I think explains one of the reasons why we're seeing such a attempt to gerrymander history now, in states that are critical race theory, and at the same time, dictating what books you can have in your library. And it's an attempt to kind of sanitize history in order to make sure that we can't make those connections. And that's something obviously I think is a huge problem. Outside of that, I do think, like the American Historical Association, I exist in these two interesting worlds. I'm a journalist, I'm also an academic historian, and I talk to these different communities. And the American Historical Association has started doing something that I think is really important, and I think that journalists should be mindful of it. When the Ukraine invasion took place, they did a roundtable with 3 historians on the history of Russia and Ukraine. And I called emailed every single journalist who I knew who might possibly ever write anything on that subject, and was like, 90 minutes, these 3 scholars are going to give you what you need to understand contextually what Russia's motivations are, historically, very complicated, much bigger than just Vladimir Putin. I spent a little bit of time in Russia as a Fulbright. I got a real earful about how people saw Ukraine, and that was 10 years ago. And so even when I talk with people now, there were people a decade ago saying that we have to take Ukraine because the West wants to use Ukraine to keep Russia weak. And so there are these outlets now that are increasingly aware that there has to be some sort of public accessibility of the kind of scholarly work that they do. And I think that there really needs to be, on the side of journalists, pursuit of that kind of information that can help you give context.
That's great. I love those ideas. Yeah, it's like what you were saying earlier. You don't know what you don't know. I had a friend who wrote a story about the Cambodian population in the greater Boston area, and made a reference to Pol Pot and the genocide. And I said, did you know that the United States was responsible for an even worse genocide that was never written about before Pol Pot, and then after, we kind of paved the way. And that sort of stuff happens over and over again. But like, it's impossible to know all these different bits and pieces of history. So all the more reason, I love this idea of having American history for journalists. Frankly, it should be just taught, period, to everyone. I would love to find a way to get newsroom editors to commit to learning about our past, at least what's happened in the US, so that we're not continually pulling stuff from the archives, which is just rife with all this stuff that's tainted. You've written about the need to democratize news and the need for newsrooms to reflect the diversity of its coverage area. This is another one of those issues where the newsroom leaders make promises. And I remember these slogans that Knight Ritter had, diversity now, like we can't wait. And these different goals and deadlines that have come and gone. We're nowhere near parity. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. I know this is a huge issue, and there's no simple solutions to this, but how do we get to parity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the diversity committee is always the most frustrating committee on any You never want to be on the diversity committee. And so, one of the things that a conversation I had once when I was on the dreaded diversity committee at an institution of higher education was that a person in a physics department said, look, we're trying to make hires in the physics department. 90% of those people who are graduating with PhDs are going to be white men. And then there's going to be fierce competition for the small number of people there who are women, and then the even smaller number of people who are people of color. And so we can't diversify because there aren't that many people in the pipeline. And I said, then we either have to be about the work of diversifying the department or diversifying the pipeline. And I said, because the presumption is that it was a natural, a natural state of affairs that led to that demographic skew. And I was like, but the fact of it is, those were the only people who historically were able to get jobs in physics. And so it's not like we've just stumbled upon this natural occurrence. I said, so are we in high schools finding kids who might not ever have thought about physics as a career? Are we out in junior colleges and community colleges trying to identify, women who have an interest in math, or people of color who have an interest in a related field, and saying, have you ever thought about physics? And it's like, until we are kind of actively working to reverse the defaults that created this world and this landscape in the first place, then we can't really say that our hands are tied, or that we've done everything that we can do. The same thing applies to journalism, which is at least more accessible. People know what journalism is. They interact with journalists every day, even if they're just turning on the television, or they're just walking past a newsstand, or getting a push alert on their phone. And so the bridge to identifying people who might be interested in that field, I think, is a much easier one, I think, to navigate. So that's part of it. I think the other part of it is then around the line of retention. People who are in the field who are leaving for some of the reasons that you pointed out. Also the kind of economic pressures that are on people. And that's a difficult one. Like, I don't think anyone has figured out, how we're going to move forward from that. But at the very least, we need to be getting people into the field. That's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing here around trying to change the tuition structure to make the school more accessible, which is just something we just flat out have to do. And that, of course, has like kind of racial and ethnic implications in its own right. And so, the pitch line, I'm going to give it to you all. This is my pitch line. I'm going to say to people, I was very happy when I came up with it. I said, the business model of journalism has changed. So the business model of journalism education now has to change. So that's what I'm going to say to people right before I ask them to give me some money. So that's kind of where we are.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. I love that pitch. I also wanted to mention, at Emerson College, the percentage of students of color is really small. But it's like that way. I've looked at stats at the local colleges and other places where I've taught in other parts of the country. It's just woefully small. And part of that is, this is the thing that no one really talks about. We're still living under plessy. We still have separate and unequal schools that don't provide the kind of education and critical thinking skills to students. Spending time teaching students to pass these various standardized tests, and overcrowded schools, and don't have the resources. And so we have to really work on fixing those pipelines. And maybe that's part of what we do as journalists, is to just expose this and to be really clear with people about it, because those changes won't take place unless we dismantle these structures. You mentioned raising funds, and you talked about connecting with historically Black colleges and universities, including your own alma mater, Howard University, and to bring those students to Columbia J School. And I'm wondering, you know, so that might help. I feel like to get to the point where we need to be, we need to make some really radical changes. And I'm wondering if you agree with that. And I'm also wondering if you can describe the ideal student body and like, how do we get there?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things we found is that we traditionally have had more applications from HBCUs, going back a decade ago. And it's just really a matter of kind of marketing. And then we found, it was like, well, what are our numbers on Hispanic serving institutions? And so we found that those numbers fluctuate, but generally speaking, the majority of applicants that we get from Hispanic serving institutions identify as white. And it was like, okay, so then we have to then make a special kind of approach to make sure that we are getting Latino applications. And then with tribal colleges, they're so small and the population is so small. I want to make sure that we are interacting with folk there. But even then, that might generate one application a year or two applications a year. And I'm like, sure, then let's get those one or two applications, because, nothing fails like failure to try or failure to even attempt. And so that's where we are with it. I don't think that in and of itself, that gets you to parity. And the fact of it is that for me, just kind of being a realist and a pragmatist, I'm aware of the extent to which we're dealing with dynamics that are much bigger than us, much bigger than Columbia Journalism School, much bigger than the journalism profession, where we're talking about where there is concentrated poverty, where there is lack of opportunity, what kind of educational dynamics people have experienced prior to getting here, all of the sorting, the kind of societal sorting that we see that produces the outcomes that, that we're talking about. Or when we looked at, COVID, which was like a great example of this, when I said this virus really doesn't care who it infects. It has no partisan biases. It has no racial or ethnic prejudices, but yet we saw Black and Latino populations being disproportionately affected by the virus. And I said, that is as pure a distillation of social inequality as you could ask for. We're seeing who is not capable of getting out of the way of this virus, who is not capable of getting adequate care when they are infected by the virus. And those are the bigger dynamics that we're dealing with. But I think at the same time, there's no excuse to not try. But on some level, it's also knowing that we're in pursuit of equality in an unequal society. And so getting to parity is going to be difficult. How close can we get to parity? I don't know. That's the reason to work hard. We may get farther than we thought we would.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I agree with you. It said that the failure of trying is the problem, and people need to actually work on this and try. I have a bunch of questions, but I do want to open it up for folks who have questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or if you want to unmute your mic and ask the question, feel free to do so. All right, I see Walter.
Hi, Walter Smith Randolph here. I'm the investigative editor at Connecticut Public. I'm a big fan. I'm also from Southeast Queens, so shout out.
Oh, wow. You should have led with that.
Right. I laughed when you said the diversity committee is the worst committee to be on, because two of my colleagues who are also on the committee here are on this call. So how do I do the work without being on the committee? Because I'm tired of being on the committee. Seriously.
I mean, sometimes you have to be on the committee, just knowing that the committee sucks. But also, I think, when I said that we traditionally got more applications from HBCUs. That wasn't a person on a diversity committee. That was a person that just took it upon himself. He had graduated from HBCU and just built a personal network of connections with people, calling deans, calling professors. I noticed we didn't get many applications from you last year. You know, do you have students that might be interested? Do I need to come down there and have a conversation with people? I mean, I think that it's possible to make a difference in just what your individual actions are. And, you know, the kind of suggestions, you know, how you move through people, certainly people who have, I'll give you an example. I was chair of a, and please, I'll try to anonymize this as much as I can, but it's probably not gonna be hard to figure it out. But I was chair of a committee for a major award. And I decided that I was gonna have kind of a free hand with this award. And we went through all the rounds of stuff, and I was just kind of like deferring, going along with people and so on. And then we come up with our list of finalists, which was, I think, 6 people. And the only thing I said was, I'm not sending 6 white people to the finalists for this award. And then it was like, oh. And then we went back through the calculation, added 2 people who should have been in the finalists all the time, one of whom actually won the award. That year, I said that single sentence was the best thing that I did that entire year. And so sometimes it is that, you know, the places where you find you can make a difference in the margins. And, you know, a lot of times there's a lot of frustration that you have to navigate to get to that place.
That's great. Thank you. That's wonderful. I was in a similar situation at Emerson, and I advocated for diversity, and I thought that I was, you know, the lone wolf crying out in the wilderness, but apparently I was heard, because then I got put on a search committee, and then doing the work in the search committee, I was like, no, we're going to weed this person out. That person's an interloper. You know, I like found ways to kind of get to the cream. So yeah, so we're getting there. So that's wonderful. I should also mention I'm a New Yorker as well. Not from Queens. I'm from Manhattan. Grew up in Harlem. Not far from Columbia.
Well,
yeah.
my parents met in Harlem before they moved to Queens and had me. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I see Lena Giraldo has a question.
Thank you, Cindy. It's so nice to meet you. It's interesting about some of the interviews you had with my grad students, and we have so many questions. I wish some of them, they have class today, so that's why they were not able to come. But I do have a question that is really kind of in my mind for a while, and it's about diversity. I am originally from Colombia. I'm an immigrant, a woman, and also trying to get my way through with all the challenges that means. And I'm very committed to really bring more diversity. I understand that the problem is the pipeline, and you say something very interesting is change takes time. And I love what you say about, I really want to change what the approach of Columbia University in the journalism department to bring more people of color. What is your timeline on this? Because I read in some of the articles that you were interviewed that many of them is about funding and getting the money for it to bring people of color. But if the problem is the timeline, how you will reach into these communities of color in New York to bring them, how is your timeline for these findings to bring the people of color? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think impatience is a virtue. So like when we first started having these conversations, we were talking about 5-year plans for things. And I was like, yeah, that's great. That's great. If we can do that within 5 years, what can we do right now?
Yeah.
And so even if it's like a pilot, you know, that you start with something, it won't be at scale, maybe. It's not as big as it's going to be. But some of it is just the fact that you do something at the very first opportunity that you have. So I'm not waiting to try to say like, oh, over the course of time, we'll do this. There's one thing that I'm trying to do. So I see Harlem is represented here. One thing that I'm trying to do next summer, which is that I want to have free media journalism workshops, for Harlem residents.
Oh, wonderful.
Because, we have this gigantic well of resources on this side of the park, this side meaning Columbia, and the absence of resources on that side of the park, meaning Harlem. And, I feel like to the extent that I can, put some of those resources in my cart and drag them over to the other side of the park, then I'm invested in doing that. And so, we teach media law here. Will it ruin our kind of budget line to say we're going to spend 2 days doing free media law workshops for people who are doing community journalism, or people who high school students who are not sure what they want to do, but maybe journalism is a thing for them. People who want to know how to report on what their community board is doing, their school board, any of those things. Like let's bring those resources over there. That doesn't show up in our stats on who's enrolled at Columbia Journalism School, but it gets us into the arena of saying, look, we are doing different things, and we're trying to address these inequities. And at the very least, like, you run into barriers or things that will require time, but you've already gotten your feet wet.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena, for that question. I see we have Ambar and then Christian.
Hi, yes, also Queen represent Jamaica side. But I was wondering what are your best practices or tips that you can share for how, if we do want to pitch ideas to leadership, ideas of initiatives, to engage more underrepresented communities with our news coverage, or like to our readership. What are the best ways to do that from the business, like to appeal to the business side of leadership?
So I think that's a really great question. One thing that I've been dean for 9 weeks now, 10 weeks. One thing I can say I have already figured out is that I am much more oriented toward proposals where I don't have to think. When people come to me and they've done all the stuff, and it's just like, oh, to implement this, we would just need to transfer, excuse me, my children had a bug and I didn't get it, but I got just a little bit of it. So I'm getting over it now, but I still have a little bit of cough.
Oh, no.
All I have to do is transfer, X amount of money and this thing starts. Oh, okay, sure, that's fine. Or even better, the ones where people have already come up with an idea of how you pay for it. That's even better in my book. But I think that having walked through the nuts and bolts benefits of initiatives around diversity and how they affect, kind of community involvement, community connections, really help. It doesn't get you everywhere, but it helps. And having anticipated the questions that people will ask on the other side of it helps. And then ultimately, the story that I always tell about, like, my first job in a newsroom, which was at the Washington City paper, and the editor.
I'm sorry, I was at the Washington City paper before my current fellowship, so I'm excited.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
No, seriously. Washington City paper people show up everywhere. They show up everywhere. It was like this great place that this kind of like sent people out, all over the world. But the city paper, when I came there, it was under David Carr, David Carr's leadership. And there were these huge issues around the paper being almost entirely white, in Washington, D.C. at that point being like 70% Black. And hostile relationship between those two entities, David was like, oh, we need to come in and hire more Black people. He didn't say it for any touchy-feely reason. He wasn't, kind of thinking about democracy and like the capital D sense, anything like that. David just said, there are stories that I'm not getting. That was it. That was his motivation. He created this internship program with the intention of helping diversify the paper. His first 2 hires were me and Ta-Nehisi Coates. We were the first 2. And without even trying, like we were just there. Nobody had engaged us. And that was like the way in. And so I think that kind of pointing that out, like, look, you get benefits from this, you get returns on this, you get demographically, this is what the country is starting to look like. We have to have like outreach to build the next generation of viewers, et cetera, of the next generation of readers, listeners, however it is that you're presenting information, and to ask that leadership have as little thinking on this to do as possible.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, guys.
Christian, yes.
Hi, my name is Christian Cologne. I'm actually, I work for Channel 3. I'm a reporter here in Hartford.
Cool.
Jelani, you were actually my professor at Columbia in 2018. You probably don't remember me. It's okay. But
okay.
But one thing that you point out that it's really
I can't see you, so I don't know.
Oh, I don't know why. There we go. Did you guys see me?
Barely. Okay, you look familiar.
Could you see me now?
I see you now.
Oh, perfect. Yes, I'm a reporter here for Channel 3. But one thing that you brought up about Columbia was just that pipeline and addressing that pipeline, because I remember I was a student there and I found myself just being in the classroom where surrounded by like elites and a lot of people with power, and just like they were obviously like the same age as me, but it was people that I really couldn't connect to in a way. And it's like, I'm from the New Haven area here in Connecticut, Puerto Rican, humble parents. But it was just interesting, and maybe we should like work on that, just recruiting, because honestly, like all you guys here, I feel like we're a little bit better journalists than the people who have that power, because we could connect with anybody, and it helps us when we're going out in the hood or wherever we go. But that's just the point that I wanted to bring up. But one of my question is just, when you are a journalist and you're trying to find maybe your next job or where to go next, or maybe if you want to stay in a place, should you what should be your thought process when maybe you should stay in a room where you are the only Latino, or you are the only diversity, or should you go to a place that appreciates diversity and maybe not only in the newsroom but in the area? So just like right now, it's like you bring out those stories that are great and you're doing the work, or should you go to a place where, I mean, you get the question. Just
that's a hard question. First, about like the kind of environment here at Columbia. So I've given that a little bit of thought. And so there's an interesting dynamic here, which is that for me, I would get like a large number of Black students, smaller number of Latino students, but not marginal, who would show up in my office and say that they felt isolated or like alienated by the environment here. My colleague, Elisa Solomon, would get a lot of LGBTQ students who would like talk about feeling like it was not a kind of embracing environment. Weirdly enough, there was a not insignificant number of white students who felt that Columbia wasn't really a welcoming environment. And the fact of it is, like, institutionally, Columbia is really not. I think the journalism school, interestingly enough, the journalism school is probably better about this than 90% of the other academic units here. There's less of it here, but there's still enough of it that it regularly registers with people. And so, I've started just in the time I've been here, kind of worked on like trying to set an institutional tone, that comes from the top about people being here. When I gave my first address to the incoming class, I made a point of saying, look, it's my experience that actual imposters never actually have imposter syndrome. So if you feel like you don't belong here, it means you do. you know? And so like trying to kind of build around that, but it is a thing. And it's part of just kind of what people have thought about this place for a really long time. On the second part of it, I mean, that's a really individual question. And you know, like what your tolerances are. You know, sometimes people kind of work in the wilderness and get to see things come to fruition in a way that they, you know, wouldn't otherwise. And then sometimes people are like very frustrated. They feel like, oh, I've been here for 5 years and nothing has changed. And these people have wasted my time. And, you know, it's, you know, for me, you know, I've taught at HBCUs. I started at HBCUs. I've taught at state institutions, and now I'm at a private Ivy League institution. I could have spent my career in any of those outlets and been okay. Like, I think some people look at my career as like an arc because I wound up in this place, but I really don't. I see it as like 3 different iterations of like what my career could have looked like. But that was for me. I think for you, it's really a matter of, you know, what your tolerance is and how much you can, you know, emotionally and, you know, career-wise afford to be in one particular place versus another.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mhm.
We're quickly running out of time, and I think we have time for one more question. And Anne was first, so Shannon, please forgive me. But if we have time, we'll try to squeeze it in. So
Oh, we
Anne,
can
if
do
you
a
could,
speed round.
yeah, let's do the speed round. Go.
Yeah. I was just wanted to get a sense of how to be a good mentor, because for the first time in my career, I'm the senior person of color in the newsroom.
Mhm.
And I'm also part of a teaching station. We're at the Sacred Heart University campuses. And I was just kind of, I became aware that the other students of color kind of look to me as a mentor. And I'm just trying to get a sense of what's a good way to approach being a good mentor for the students.
Mhm. That's a really good question. And, you know, I'll try to give a succinct answer to it. But, you know, part of it is, I think, listening with a sense of kind of getting from them what they need. And, you know, that will, I think, help dictate, you know, what kind of mentoring you do. And I also would consult with people who have been, you know, in the mentor position, and also think about the most valuable things from the mentors that you had. Like, I have a roster of mentors in my life that I am endlessly indebted to. And I remember like a lot of what they told me, what they showed me, what they tried to expose me to. Sometimes it comes down to like making a list of what those things are. But I think that, you know, primarily listening, you know, listening from the people you're mentoring and listening to the people who mentored you is the best place to start with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shannon, if let's see if we can do this in a super speed round. You got the mic. You might need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Hi from Navajo Reservation. So my question was more so on what Ann Lopez was addressing, you know, how to be more so of a person of color, having to put more input to students who are in high school already. I'm Navajo, you know, and you were speaking about like the 1% of how many people actually do go into the journalism field. What is your thought and your criteria of having to have actually no Indigenous person in the actual media?
I didn't hear the last thing you said. No Indigenous person in what?
What are your thoughts about there being no Indigenous in the media?
Oh, I mean, it's fundamentally part of the same dynamics that we've been talking about.
Yes,
you know,
but
yeah.
Within more of approach, it's kind of like the issues that do go on within tribal areas do affect what happens in society within its own region. So it's kind of like, how do you put this information with what's going on in our communities to be an outlet to actually be a part of mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, we had Tristan Atone here how long ago was that? Like the pandemic has destroyed my sense of time. So I don't know, maybe that was like 4 months ago. It might have been longer. We were talking with him about some of those issues. And then, to the, like, where possible, we've been doing things with support indigenously. The newsletter and trying to remember the founder of that. Her name is going to come to me 5 minutes later. I'm like terrible because we actually have done work with her. But the first thing is, I think that we're trying to make sure that we're supporting, those outlets and those voices that are out there. Like when we were doing something on climate change, it was just on a kind of whim. We're like, if we're talking about Alaska, I bet you there's some indigenous voices there that we need to look at. And then, they're like podcasts, we're reporting about indigenous issues and as it relates to climate change. And I think that some of it is just being conscious of even needing to start in that place. But it is like, we don't want to be exemplary of the same thing that we're talking about not knowing and not knowing that you don't know, and so it requires a level of, I think, proactivity or proactiveness to start incorporating those voices into everything that you do. And, for us, I'm also, in terms of our hiring, I'm like, have we ever had an indigenous faculty member here? Like, no, well, let's make sure that when we're running these searches, we're reaching out to make sure that we have indigenous applicants represented here. And at the least, I see it as like the democracy project. At the very least, we're trying to push the version of democracy that as members of the press we're supposed to be upholding in the first place.
Sorry to interrupt. We are running out of time. We're almost out of time. I just want to very quickly show, this is the book that Professor Cobb was talking about, News for All the People, Juan Gonzalez and Joseph Torres. So yeah, I highly recommend this book as well.
They'll be here early November. You'll probably see it. But
that's great.
Yeah, we're doing an event.
I want to kick it back to Vanessa for some closing thoughts. And again, thank you so much, Jelani. This has been illuminating, and I hope we can continue the conversation one day in person.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you for the invitation. Be good, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Jelani Cobb and Cindy. Thanks to our sponsor for this event, the New England News Collaborative. This is such an inspiring conversation with actionable tips for us to take away. And again, if you could support our scholarship fund to help us grow that pipeline that Jelani Cobb was talking to us about, we'd appreciate it. The link was in the chat. Thank you so much again.
Y'all email me that link?
We will, absolutely, sir.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.